And thank you for joining us for today's Taste Talks. Today, we are so excited to have Lydia Burns, our resident cheesemonger, back again to, now last time she spoke about goat cheese and enlightened us on that. And today she is going to be demystifying sheep cheese for us. So moving on to a different animal produced cheese. So very excited to hear all of the details of this kind of cheese as well, Lydia.
Yeah, so I know a lot of you guys were with us the last time, so a lot of this will seem a little redundant, but it's just how it's germane to the sheep versus the goat or cow's milk, the other main producers of or ruminants that we use to make cheese from. And so we'll go over a couple little slides first, but then we'll get more into sort of the various styles of sheep cheese, what sheep cheeses you might encounter on the market, and sort of some other special considerations that are specific to sheep cheeses. So first we'll start with this milk comparison that we did last time. So as you remember from last time, this is a composite. So this is based on sort of averages. There are lots of variation in the sub-breeds of the species themselves, but just to give you a general comparison, so sheep we're gonna find down here because besides water buffalo, sheep has the highest fat of all the traditional ruminant breeds or species. And one thing to consider though, because I think sometimes, especially in this country, we think of fat and we think of it as bad, but actually sheep's milk is high in the good fats. So even though it is higher in fat, there are a lot of health benefits that come with sheep's cheese, and we'll get into those in a little bit. Also has a higher percentage of those protein solids, which is known as the casein. And this is what forms the body of the cheese itself. And so this is the highest of all the milks that we use traditionally to make cheese. The lactose as well is a little bit higher, but lactose is pretty similar across the board. But then you'll look over here in the total solids, which is really the fat and the protein solids combined. And sheep has noticeably the most. And so this will really come into play when you make the cheese. It takes less sheep's milk to yield cheese because of that higher solids. But again, we get down to the issue of the yield, and sheep compared to cow and goat and water buffalo yield the least amount of milk as a percentage of their body weight. So even though their milk is more rich and more dense, it takes a lot more sheep to get enough milk to make cheese. So when we speak of sheep, the females are the ewes and the males are the rams. So that lactation cycle we talked about last time is pretty similar to a sheep as it is a goat. They are also considered seasonal lactators because they don't lactate for as long as a cow. So there has to be some amount of time when the animals are not milking. But again, you can stagger your breeding so that you always have some animals in your herd that are producing milk. So traditionally with sheep, what happens is the lambs are weaned for a month. And this is a little bit longer than most other animals in sort of traditional dairy settings. So you have to factor that in, because as long as the lambs are weaning, it means you don't really have milk from that animal for freed up for cheese or other production. And so after that month, the ewes then produce milk between 4 to 8 months. I know that's a huge range, but again, the breed of sheep has a huge part to do with this, as well as some other factors in terms of where the animals are. And then because this cycle does also change because of seasonality, even as it pertains to the different breeds, You'll find that most sheep dairies will do a winter birth cycle if they are going to be seasonal, because a winter birth will yield the longest milk production cycle. So that means that the first sheep's milk cheeses would start being available similar to goat if they were only bred seasonally. They would be available like towards the end of March, early April is when you first start seeing those cheese. And then for sheep's milk, they would be drying off, not creating any more milk usually. Depends again on certain factors, but October, November, December, somewhere in there. So one of the big benefits to sheep is that even though you need a lot of them, temperament-wise, sheep are very versatile and pretty easy to manage. If you've ever seen images of the cattle dogs who manage huge herds of sheep, they're quite easily rounded up. I lived in New Zealand, and a common occurrence was sheep herds would cross the street, and you would see them from in the distance, and there would be tons of sheep, hundreds and hundreds of sheep, and you would think this is going to take forever. And then they let two little dogs out of a cage, and within minutes, the entire herd of sheep is across the road in a very organized manner. So they are herded easily, which is one of the reasons that they are pretty apt to being a dairying breed, even though their yield is quite low. And they also can adapt to really intense and rugged terrains, mountains, deserts where there's sparse vegetation. So this is why we often associate sheep's milk with Spain. And Spain is actually one of the only countries where sheep is the primary producer of milk and dairy products. And this is because of the unique topography and different climates of Spain, particularly in the south. They're not really conducive to cows. Some are conducive to certain breeds of goat, but sheep are the most versatile in terms of adapting to rugged environments. So the yield of milk of the sheep, as I mentioned before, is the lowest yield as a percentage of their body weight. They can only produce about 3% of their body weight. So this means that 150-pound ewe will produce up to 4.5 pounds of milk, which is not very much when we're talking about converting that into cheese. So again, the grazing habits, they really can thrive in sparse and rugged conditions. They can find little plants that grow between the rocks, and they can graze on high, rocky, and more barren pasture lands. One of the special concerns with sheep that's a little more labor intensive is that they need to be sheared. But then some people, depending on the breeds they work with, some of the dairy breeds are also good wool breeds, like Merino is a very famous one. And so sometimes even though it is labor intensive, you can sort of have, tangential businesses, if that makes sense. You can shear the sheep and sell that shearing, as well as also produce milk and cheese.
So the 4.5 pounds, that's per ewe, correct?
Yeah. Like if it's 150-pound ewe. Again, this is average. The breeds will make a big difference in that, but on average, that's the yield.
But is that for the whole season, or per day, or per week?
Oh, per day.
Oh, per day. Okay.
Yeah, since the animals are milked daily, that's usually how we look at their yield. So the properties, as we mentioned before, sheep's milk has the most solid content. So it takes less sheep's milk to make cheese than it does cow or goat's milk. And there's a high butterfat content in sheep's milk, which tends to give sheep's milk a really distinctive buttery and rich texture. But similar to the goat's milk, sheep's milk is made up of smaller fat molecules than cow's milk. So a lot of people find that even though we notice the lactose numbers are all similar, it's not actually lactose that a lot of people have issues with digesting cheese. because there's very little lactose in cheese in general, especially more aged. But it actually a lot of times has to do with the way the fat is compromised. And in the case of sheep, because of these smaller molecules, it's a lot easier to digest than cow's milk. And then we'll get a little bit more into this in the next 2 slides, but just a little science. But in addition to those free chain fatty acids we talked about in goat that yield very specific flavors, there's also phenolic compounds that attribute to the flavors we tend to label as sheepy or associate with sheep cheeses. And then the color, lastly, so the color of sheep's milk tends to lie between goat's milk and cow's milk, goats being the most white, the most pale, and cow's milk tending to have more of a yellow hue. Sheep, like goat, break down beta carotene into colorless vitamin A, but because of the larger percentage of fat, as sheep's milk ages, it sometimes takes on a slightly golden or straw colored hue. In the fresher cheeses, it tends to stay white, but with age, you will sometimes find a slightly straw or like slightly golden hue to the cheeses. So a lot of times, much like goaty, people tend to describe sheep milk cheeses as sheepy. A lot of times what they're referring to is like a lanolin or a woolly quality. I don't think sheep is as tangy as goat, but that sometimes people do find it more tangy than cow. So that is a word that's often associated with it. And it can, again, vary. The flavors will vary quite dramatically depending on the age and style of the cheese. But there's another flavor that we often find in more aged sheep cheeses similar to the goat, where people will say there's a sweetness or there's a caramel-like flavor. And this, again, like the goat's milk, is due to those fatty acids that are a result of lipolysis. So when you use the enzymes as the cheeses break down, they cut off the fatty acids from those triglyceride fat molecules. And then once they're free, they're volatile and they interact with your aroma receptors. So these are some of the unique fatty acids found in sheep's milk that lend itself that, those sort of characteristic sheepy flavors. And then in addition to those free chain fatty acids, these phenolic compounds are thought to contribute to sheepy flavor, especially those sweet caramel undertones. And phenolic compounds are a little complicated, but they're sort of acidic or alcohol-like and tend to be responsible for a lot of flavors in food products, not just cheese, but in general. So that is our little science part of the discussion. But then the more practical information is sort of what sheep cheeses do you find on the market, what distinguishes them. And we'll sort of go in the same, sort of the same format as we did with goat, starting with the fresh cheeses. And there are fresh sheep cheeses. So similar to Chev, there's fresh sheep's cheese. It's usually called brebis, which is the French word for sheep, just like Chev is the French word for goat. And it's made the exact same way, in terms of some sort of acidification, and the milk clots, and then you drain out the liquid component, and then you have sort of this formless fresh cheese that's really an expression of that milk. It can be a little bit tricky to find, particularly here in the States, but more and more so we do have some producers dedicated to raising sheep or making sheep's milk cheeses. And so there are a couple in Wisconsin who make a fresh sheep cheese. There's Hidden Springs Creamery, which makes a fresh sheep cheese called Driftless, which is quite nice. There's also a creamery called Landmark Creamery that's based outside of Madison, Wisconsin, and they also make a brebis. And I think their brebis they label it brebis, so that's what they sell it under, BREBIS. There's another producer in Missouri called Green Dirt they make a fresh cheese. But when you go overseas, particularly in Spain and France, you find a decent amount of fresh sheep cheese as well, but you don't often find those super fresh ones here because of sort of the logistics and transportation of getting those really fresh cheeses here. But fortunately now we have some of our own to lean on. And these, I find, a lot of times people find it sort of similar to Chev, but I'd say the main difference is there's less of that tang, that sort of acidic quality, and there's more of like a lemony brightness. And then the texture is quite different because of that higher fat content. It tends to have a little bit more of a denser, richer texture. Then we move on to what we talked about last time, is 1 degree separated from fresh, which is are those soft ripened cheeses. Now, I would say of all the categories of sheep cheeses, these are the ones that are the hardest to find in the United States. Again, because of the transport issues, we don't get a ton of imported versions of these cheeses. We get a little bit more than we do of the fresh, but then domestically, there are a couple people who produce them, but as we'll get into later, it's quite expensive to produce sheep's milk cheeses in the States. And we touched on this last time, and there's a lot of reasons for this. The most important one being that we have to start from scratch with genetics. And because we cannot bring in semen or animals from overseas who have a long tradition of dairying sheep, they're like in La Mancha, Spain, the Manchega sheep yields 3 times the milk of the average American dairying sheep, which is pretty significant when you're talking about needing mass quantities of milk in order to make a harder aged cheese like Manchego. So this really drives up the cost. And then in addition, because we don't have as long of a history or the government subsidization for specialized farming here as they do in Europe, we'll also find that, you know, when you're buying a farmstead or small producer cheese from the States, you're paying for a little bit of everything: the labor, the land, the animals, all of the startup costs. Whereas when you're talking about a 6th generation sheep milk producer in Italy or Spain, all of that is already, you know, done in the family. So a lot of these things make a big difference. So we do have, because of this, we have less people working with sheep in the United States. And then the people who are, those products are going to be significantly more expensive than their European counterparts. So this particularly comes into play in the soft ripened category, because this is another one where it's best to go domestic in terms of transport, but still you'll find that some of the more viable options that are more readily available are actually still imported. But there are a couple local farms that make some really nice soft ripened sheep cheeses. My favorite is from Minnesota, and it's from Nerstrand. It's called Shepherd's Way, and they are a dairy committed to sheep's milk production, and they make a small brie style cheese. It's actually a mix of sheep and cow, but they make a whole range of sheep's milk cheeses, and they've been making sheep's milk cheeses for 20 years in this country. They were one of the first. And then additionally, Green Dirt, which I mentioned, is in Missouri. They also make some nice soft ripened cheeses, but it can be a little bit harder to find these sort of brie style or softer, soft ripened cheeses in sheep's milk. Whereas when you go to Italy, there's a bunch of roviolas that are made from just sheep milk, and they're quite prevalent. And also in Spain, you'll find a large variety of sort of soft, fresh sheep's milk cheeses, because in Spain, sheep is the king of the dairying animals. So even in the grocery stores, you'll just find cartons of sheep milk, which fluid sheep's milk is incredibly hard to find in the United States. So then we move into the category, which is by far the most prevalent on our shelves here in the States and in cheese cases, which is the the more aged cheeses or the semi-firm to firm cheeses, this is where classic Italian pecorinos mostly fall. This is where Manchego would fall, even if it's a younger profile versus an old profile. And the Basque cheeses, which are also a very famous class of sheep's milk cheeses. But then we also have a lot of domestic producers making some really nice aged sheep's milk cheeses. The ones I named before, Hidden Springs and Landmark out of Wisconsin, both have some nice aged sheep's milk cheeses on the market. In addition to Carr Valley, which is in Wisconsin, you'll find some sheep milk cheeses from them as well. And then one of the original sheep milk farms is located in California, and it's called Bellwether Farms. And they make a couple cheeses that are inspired by Italian pecorinos. And those are quite lovely cheeses as well. And they're those you would find more likely in a Whole Foods or a specialty cheese shop. But they're another sort of one of these pioneers of American artisan cheese. And so then last, we move into what we would like sheep blue. And sheep blue cheeses are more common than goat's milk blue cheeses. And the main reason for this is because one of the most famous blue cheeses that is a PDO from Europe is Roquefort, the famous blue from France. And Roquefort is by PDO, by law, only made from sheep's milk. And the reason for this is not just because that is the local animal that prevails in the region where Roquefort reigns from, but also the idea is that the richness of the sheep's milk, the higher solid content, the higher fat content, all those minerals help to offset the intensity, the piquancy of those blue molds. So it was intentionally by design that they started making blue cheeses from sheep's milk because of these unique qualities. So, and because of the popularity and the reputation of Roquefort, it's certainly a style that is emulated all across the globe. And so we have people making sheep's milk blues all over the world now, including here in the States. And my favorite is from Shepherd's Way, who I mentioned, is in Minnesota. They make a sheep's milk blue called Big Woods Blue. And it's quite different from Roquefort in texture, but I find it's a really great expression of the sheep's milk, and you get this beautiful mineral quality and taste to it, in addition to that hit of blue that we all come to expect or anticipate with blue cheese. So that's another one I would encourage seeking out.
Lydia, quick question, just to touch back on some of the domestic creameries. Do you know where in California Bellwether Farms?
It's in Sonoma.
Okay.
I don't know like specifically, but it is north of San Francisco in the general Sonoma area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And they have cows as well. They have Jersey cows and sheep. So they do mix cheeses, but then they also do the San Andreas, which is at the 100% sheep milk pecorino. And then Papato, which is the San Andreas, but with whole peppercorn in it. So it's like a Italian peppercorn pecorino. So I would say that sheep cheese is something that it's not as polarizing as goat cheese. I don't often have customers coming up to the counter saying they don't want sheep cheese with the frequency they do goat cheese. But I also think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the cheeses they like are made from sheep's milk, namely pecorino. I've had a lot of customers be like, I really want a cow's milk cheese. Oh, I love pecorino. And you're like, well, it's not a cow's milk cheese. Pecca actually means sheep, and Reno is from sheep. So the name itself, if you know Italian, is a big tip off to where the milk comes from. And pecorino is a broad style in Italy because it just means sheep cheese. So you'll find fresco pecorino, which is fresh, semi-stagionato, which means semi-aged, stagionato, which is aged. And then they're made in regional recipes all throughout the country. So Tuscany is most famous for sheep, but we also have a lot of sheep tradition in Sardinia and in the South as well. But I would say by far, Tuscan pecorino is probably the most famous, as well as the classic Roman pecorino, pecorino romano. And there's a ton of variation, even just within the flavors that you find in these pecorinos. Again, a lot of it has to do with age, but a lot of it has to do with make too. The Tuscan pecorinos tend to be more olive oil, buttery, nutty, have those sort of classic sheep flavors, whereas pecorino romano is quite intense. It's not my favorite cheese to eat on its own. I find it's a great ingredient cheese. Sometimes it's a little rough on its own, but that's also intentional. That's the style of the cheese, because it was designed mostly to finish products, like finish like you would on pasta or pizza. And so it does have a more salty, intense flavor than some of the table pecorinos that are made just for consumption on their own. So you still get this broad diversity of flavor, but I find that culinarily speaking, sheep's cheeses have a ton of applications. There are some of my favorite cheeses to use shaved in salads or to like top a soup. And I think it's just, again, you get those characteristic sheep's milk flavors. It's brown butter or olive oil, a little nuttiness. They tend to be really pleasant. And with the exception of some specific styles like the Romano, in general, I find they're very approachable cheeses that most people enjoy. So, you know, even though we sometimes miss out on that middle texture in this country in terms of that like semi-soft squidgy sheep cheese, the more aged ones are great for, you get those complex flavors, and then they're great for finishing dishes. So in addition to eating on their own. So they're kind of a great option to have if you like to cook with the cheeses that you have on hand, in addition to enjoying them on their own. So that for me, they're always a go-to if you just want something that's really versatile in your fridge. So yeah, and then I'll finish, like I mentioned at the beginning, that sheep's milk is desirable because it has a lot of health benefits. In addition to the good fats, it's actually quite high, the highest of all the milks in tons of minerals. So calcium, iron, magnesium, zinc, and then riboflavin. And then there's these, if you guys are really into health, there's these like 10 essential amino acids that are supposed to have a lot of health benefits. And sheep's milk has all of those, in addition to vitamins B and D, and also linoleic acid, which is another really healthy property of certain natural foods. And so, yeah, these are all things that people are really into food. I think as we get more into where our food comes from, how it's made, what we're using to make it, I think sheep's milk will continue to hopefully become more popular as people understand that why it might be more expensive and value it beyond just like seeing it as another cheese in the case. So for now, we can still enjoy all of our imported sheep cheeses in addition to our more expensive domestic ones, but hopefully with time, we'll see more and more people here in the States sort of dedicating themselves to raising sheep for dairy. Were there any questions?
Yes, anyone have any questions on sheep's cheese? Who's planning to go out and buy something now?
There is the Bulgarian cheese, which is usually feta cheese, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just read that it can be cow or goat or sheep. What's unique in that cheese? I know it's from being a kid, I ate a lot of that, but why is it so rich, and what's unique in it?
Well, so feta can be made from any milk. There is a subpedio traditional Greek feta actually has to be made from sheep's milk, but this is a very small labeling because that's the traditional recipe. And here in the States, you can find feta being made from goat, cow, sheep, or any mix of those three animals. My personal favorite is sheep milk feta, 100% sheep's milk feta. And you can find them at Whole Foods. I would encourage you to taste them side by side because I think there's quite a big difference. Unlike popular or to like maybe what someone's concept might be, I find that cow's milk sort of has the most off flavors when it comes to feta. It can have that little bit of acrid flavor, whereas the sheep and the goat's milk tend to be a little softer. But the reason I prefer 100% sheep over all of them is because, again, the higher solids and the higher fat content make for an extremely creamy feta, and that's my preference. So it holds its form, but you'll find if you're cooking with it or even just in a dish, it just really kind of melts into it, and it has a really lush texture and flavor, whereas the goats and cow tend to be a little crumblier and drier. So it's really my preference in terms of the flavor and the texture. And a little trick I have is that even though most the feta here is not domestic, it's mostly Greek or French. There's a French producer called Valbraiso, who is one of my favorites for feta, and they make a goat feta and a sheep feta, which is, I believe, the feta that you would find at Whole Foods labeled as goat feta or sheep feta. They don't specify the brand because they package it, but I'm pretty sure that's still the producer they work with. But because we live in Chicago and there's a large Middle Eastern population and markets, there's the same brand, Valbraiso, packages the sheep milk feta in these tins. And the tin is like 1.5 pounds. And it's great for holding it because it has brine. So I usually buy like one of those, like maybe every 6 months or so, because it'll hold up. It has a little lid that is resealable. And if you keep it submerged in the brine, it'll keep really long, but it's packaged specifically for the Middle Eastern market. And it's cheaper than the ones you would buy that are packaged for normal stores. So I buy that one at the Pita Inn market or the Middle Eastern bakery market up on Foster. They also have it at Harvest Time. And I
think they have it at Fresh Farms too.
Yes, Fresh Farms would have it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it has.
Renee says you must use your feta much more conservative than she does.
I don't when I use it. The problem is that I usually have, well, not a problem. I have a lot of cheeses in my fridge. So it's like, I sort of pick and choose the ones that I have to use first. But I do, anytime a recipe calls for feta or any cheese, I usually double what they tell you to put in it. So I find that more cheese never hurts. It only helps.
This is true.
But that one's great. Not just because of the way it's packaging, but it's a great, I mean, they usually retail for like, it varies significantly, but anywhere from like 12 to 15 bucks. So it ends up being, for sheep feta, it ends up being, maybe like $8-10 a pound, which is pretty good. So, yeah, that would be a fun experiment. And that's a good point because even though feta is quite salty because of the brine, you really can tell a difference between the melts when you taste them side by side. So it's kind of a fun little experiment. If you like feta, it sounds like you use it a lot. So maybe you could do that anyways.
Okay. Anything else, folks? No? Well, I think that is going to be it for today. If you came in a little late, not a problem at all. We will have this taste talk up on the YouTube tomorrow by the afternoon at the latest. And as I mentioned earlier, this is our last taste talk for this week. We only have one this week. And then the next taste talk coming up will be On Wednesday, the 17th, we will be having a very special Wine Wednesday where we will be doing a virtual wine tasting. So Mary Ross has selected 3 styles of wines. If you do not have this list and would like to participate, please reach out to me at taste@nl.edu. And I can send you the list of the 3 wines to go and shop for if you would like to join along with us as we taste these 3 wines together. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Lydia, anything else at all? Nope, we're all good. All right, well, thank you everyone and have a great evening. The sun hasn't set yet, so if you have time, make sure and go out and get yourself some vitamin D from there. All right, bye everyone.
Or maybe buy sheep cheese.
Yes, and then buy some sheep cheese. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.